following are a few technical notes of information to assist you during the webinar. If you have a technical problem, please call GoToWebinar attendee support at the toll-free number typed in red and provide today's webinar ID that you see typed in red also. As you participate in this webinar, we invite you to expand the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag NASSP webinar. We are also on Facebook at facebook.com/principals. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available as well as a PowerPoint on the NASSP website within 24 hours at nassp.org/webinar. I'm pleased to present Allison Morris. She is a child nutrition policy analyst from the Food Research and Action Center, which works to improve public policies and public-private partnerships to eradicate hunger and undernutrition in the United States. NASSP collaborates with FRAC because research has proven that academic performance, behavior, tardiness, and absenteeism significantly improve when school breakfast and lunch are made available to students. This is one of our initiatives that also support well-being, and so Allison will speak to us briefly before we introduce our speaker around wellness. Allison?
Great. Thank you, Joan, for the introduction, and thank you everyone for joining us today. As she said, my name is Allison Maurice, and I'm with the Food Research and Action Center, FRAC for short, and essentially most of my work revolves around ensuring that low-income children have access to school breakfast. So today I'm going to talk to you about how you can use breakfast after the bell, which is an innovative service model, as really a tool for educating and reaching the holistic needs of your students. So you can proceed to the next slide. So Joan gave a great summary of the work that FRAC does, but I just want to emphasize that we really approach the issue of food insecurity and hunger from a holistic way. And so we conduct a lot of research and do policy analysis on federal and state policies that impact child nutrition programs. And we provide a lot of technical assistance as well in deciphering what these federal policies mean at the ground level. So just to say that anyone should always feel free to reach out to me because that is, what I do is just providing assistance to school districts that need it. So, and we also serve as a clearinghouse for some grant money as well. So depending on where you are in the country, we do have grants available to help schools implement innovative breakfast service models. Next slide. And then quickly just talk a little bit more about the FRAC and NASSP partnership. So the purpose is to increase school breakfast participation among low-income students, and through that we actually have a Breakfast for Learning Education Alliance, which brings together a whole host of national education organizations who have all signed on to a statement of purpose saying that this is a priority for them and that their networks support the use of innovative breakfast service models that reach more children. And you can see that we've developed a whole host of resources around this with these other education organizations, including NASSP, and I'll be talking more about those resources that we've done in collaboration with NASSP today. Next slide. So what does eating have to do with academic success? You got a bit of a teaser with Joan's introduction, but essentially there's a lot of research to support that children who are hungry do not do as well in school. So next slide. So school breakfast is associated with better performance on standardized tests, increased math and reading scores, improved cognitive ability, and improved behavior and a reduction in tardiness and absenteeism. So many of you on testing days might offer some sort of second chance breakfast or a snack to your students, and you do that because you know that in order for them to be alert and do as best as they can on their standardized tests, that they have to have the food that they need to be nourished. And so we advocate that instead of just doing that on days when the children are testing, that you can actually extend this model throughout the entire school year so that your students are alert and at peak ability just during a regular school day, and that we don't just focus on those testing days, but we really focus on the day-to-day instruction with students and making sure that they are that they have the nutrition they need to be successful throughout the day. And we do find that schools that implement innovative breakfast service models really see improved behavior, particularly in that morning time. Especially if a child hasn't eaten since the day before at school, they are more likely to be quite cranky in the morning due to hunger. So we do see that schools that utilize these programs see a major reduction in behavior issues and school nurse visits, particularly in the morning. Next slide. Just really quickly, just to show one of the resources that FRAC puts out every year, we look at school breakfast participation across the nation, and we rank states on how well they reach the students that are eligible for free and reduced price meals with school breakfast. And we do know that despite the major strides made over the last 10 years or so, that only 56.6 low-income children participated in school breakfast for every 100 low-income child that participated in school lunch on an average day. So we do know that we are still missing a large proportion of low-income children with this really important morning meal. Next slide. So what are the barriers to school breakfast participation? So many of you that work in a public school, typically breakfast is served in the cafeteria before the start of the day. And so students really struggle to get there in time to utilize breakfast, or their parents might be unaware that the program even exists. There is a historical stigma that school breakfast is really only for the poor kids. So therefore, kids are less likely to utilize it in that way. And then schools that aren't able to offer breakfast for free for all students, that 30-cent co-payment for the reduced price breakfast can be a problem for struggling families who are trying to stretch their budgets, particularly if they have multiple kids in the school system. They really can't afford to be purchasing that extra meal every day. So these are just some of the barriers that we find really keep low-income children from being able to participate in the program. Next slide. So that's where breakfast after the bell comes in. And as previously stated, this is an innovative service model that really reaches the most students because you bring breakfast to where they are rather than having students seek that out. And particularly with high school students, even if they are at school early enough to utilize breakfast, probably they're going to be with their friends socializing, and they're not going to be thinking about that. And we do hear some people say, well, if a kid is really hungry, they'll find, a way to eat. And what we find is that that's not necessarily always true, that stigma associated with school breakfast, that it's really only for poor kids, can really impact a student's decision, particularly at the older age, as to whether or not they're going to seek out that resource or service. So breakfast after the bell can come in a few different models. One of the most popular for high schools is the grab and go or the second chance breakfast, and sometimes they're combined. But essentially, it's moving breakfast out of the cafeteria and putting a quick and easy grab and go cart or a kiosk in the hallway, somewhere where the students are going anywhere, the entrance to the building, and where students just can quickly grab the components of a breakfast and take it back to eat in their first period or their homeroom classroom. Second chance is another method where you actually have students who you have the students come to school, go to their first period or homeroom, however it's set up, and then there's a short break in between first and second period where the students can quickly grab another opportunity to grab a breakfast. And we know that high school students aren't always particularly hungry first thing in the morning, and so this second chance breakfast is really popular in high schools, and I had it where I grew up, and I always ate breakfast during that time, while I never would have eaten breakfast during, before the start of the school day. Next slide. So we developed with NASSP the Secondary Schools Principals Breakfast After the Bell Toolkit, and it's essentially a toolkit that's meant to be to make implementation of this program as easy as possible for secondary school principals. Of course, any type of program involving school nutrition, you will need to collaborate very closely with your school nutrition department. But the reason why we created this toolkit is really because what we find is that usually the school nutrition department is really gung-ho about implementing one of these models, but the principals aren't quite sure that it's something they want to be a part of or that they want to do. And so we wrote this toolkit as a way to help principals realize that it doesn't have to be super complicated. It doesn't have to be a huge mess. And the planning and implementation process can go smoothly as long as you have a plan set in place. So this toolkit is meant to help you with all of that. And that can be found on the FRAC website as well. And we can go to the next slide. And these are just some sample materials. So the image with the fruit and the pickle on the fork is just a sample PowerPoint that principals can use to actually educate their other staff as to why they're changing how breakfast is being served. Sometimes teachers can be a little resistant to having breakfast coming into their classroom because it's another thing that they have to deal with, or it's going to be, cause them to worry about cleanup and messes. So this sample PowerPoint kind of addresses all those issues and all these foreseen challenges that we do know come up, so that you can have a lot of stakeholder buy-in, which is really important towards these programs' success. And then on the right, did you know you can grab breakfast on the go? That's just a sample flyer that you can use, and this is just a marketing material so that you can let your students know where they can now be grabbing breakfast. The whole idea, though, is that you're going to place the grab-and-go cart or kiosk somewhere where students are going anyway. So this is just a nice reminder that, did you know you can pick up a breakfast on your way into school type of thing. But hopefully where you place your grab-and-go, it will be really obvious and students will be kind of drawn to that area anyway. So next slide. And we also, a few years back, we did a report with NASSP called Secondary School Principals Share What Works. And essentially we surveyed a bunch of high school principals that have already implemented breakfast after the bell to find out what their perceptions of the program are and how well they believe that it was working. And 87% of principals believe other principals should consider launching a similar program. 82% of principals noted increases in school breakfast participation. And then you can see the positive outcomes observed by principals. So a great increase in improved student attentiveness, and then a good increase in observing fewer visits to the school nurse, and absenteeism, disciplinary referrals, etc. So you can see that there. But essentially, these are other school principals who have said, we took the leap in implementing this program, and it really went well for us, and we encourage other principals to do the same. So next slide. And this is just some information on how this report was written. So we did survey 105 secondary school principals from 67 different districts. So, and they provide a lot of best practices regarding how to launch breakfast after the bell in their secondary schools. So you can also find this on FRAC's website, and it's a great tool just to learn more about breakfast after the bell from other principals. Next slide. So that's all I have for you today. But again, you should always feel free to reach out to me directly. I'm happy to chat and talk you through kind of what this would look like and coordinate meetings between you and your school nutrition director, whatever makes the most sense. But we really would love to get more schools involved in this because it is really the best way to reach low-income students. So thank you, and thank you, NASSP, for having me.
Thank you so much, Allison, for sharing the research and resources around the FRAC initiative. And it's so well linked to what Carla will be sharing with us today. And we're pleased to have with us today Carla, who is recognized as an expert on social emotional learning, mindfulness, and yoga practices in the school setting. She's the founder of Mindful Practices and oversees a team of 20 dedicated practitioners who have served over 4,000 students and teachers across the country. She's also an accomplished author, and she'll share about those books with you. Before Carla starts, I just want to remind you that during the webinar, we invite your questions. Please submit them using the question box on your GoToWebinar panel on the right-hand side. We'll respond to as many questions as time permits. If we run out of time to answer all questions, we will respond by email following the broadcast. And now I would like to present Carla to start the webinar.
Thank you so much, Joan. And I want to take a moment, as you so eloquently put it, to acknowledge the work that Allison is doing with FRAC, and that that FRAC and NASSP are doing together. I cannot say enough to support the importance of breakfast in school, meals in schools, when we talk about creating a safe and equitable school climate. I think that making sure that our students' needs are met, the physical and emotional needs are so important. So kudos to FRAC and kudos to NASSP for putting a toolkit together. I can't wait to dive in and take a look. So as Joan mentioned, my name is Carla Tantillo-Philibert, and I am the founder of Mindful Practices. I'm also the author of the books you see on your screen, Everyday SEL, which is a collection of social emotional learning resources that Routledge commissioned me to write. At first, it was just an elementary version, a middle school version, and then Routledge said, hey, we need to make sure that we have a version for districts that want to roll this out top to bottom, and that included a high school version, which is very exciting as well. Next slide, please. So real quick, I want to give a snapshot of my organization. Anyone who's been to Chicago, who's with us today, you know that Chicago is a very demographically diverse city, and the mission of my organization has been to serve a very demographically diverse cohort of schools that started in 2006 and now has expanded to multiple states and across the world. You know, I'm in Iowa, I'm in New Hampshire, and Texas. And the reason that I say that is I think it's so important to think of this work not belonging to a certain city or not belonging to a certain demographic, but work that is important to all of us, especially in today's political climate. Next slide, please. So I'm going to share a story about when I was a high school teacher. And I was at this point wearing a hat of a high school teacher and also curriculum director, as I was part of a team that started a high school in Chicago's Little Village neighborhood. This is a neighborhood that was and sadly is plagued by gang violence. And at the time, we decided to create a late start model, meaning that we had the students from 1 o'clock to 7 o'clock p.m. so they weren't as open to be recruited for gangs, because we'd done our homework and we realized that gang recruitment happens so often on campuses, school campuses, around like 3:30, 4:30, 5:30. And so if we had students in school with us during that time, that they would be less likely to be recruited for gangs. That was, you know, the case. We were having really great traction, keeping students out of gang violence, out of being recruited. And I'm noticing that a student that was typically quite engaged was not. So here I am, I'm at the board, I've got my haiku poetry lesson up, I'm super jazzed about it. I'm expecting my students to be jazzed about it too. And they're not. And this one student who was quite triggered, and I'm checking in with him, Roger, what's going on? Nothing. And only after we check in with the school social worker, only after we find out that his younger sister had been stealing food from the cafeteria and trying to figure out what was going on, did we realize that Roger's mom had gone missing. She had gone on a heroin bender, and sadly, this was not the first time, and she was gone. And so Roger couldn't focus on my haiku poetry lesson any more than he could focus on the math class that was coming the period after mine, because he was concerned about his mother's safety. He was concerned about taking care of his siblings. Now, in a regular school day, that would be difficult enough, but compounded by the fact that he lived in a community where domestic violence was rampant, gang violence was rampant, and that he didn't have food for his siblings. Now, one of the things that I think when I reflect back on this story, one of the things that always strikes me is how I didn't see any of the signs, right? How did it take me day 3, day 4 in this scenario where, this kid's off. Wow, he's off again. Oh, wow, he's off again. And then how did I not have the pulse of something that the rest of the students in his class knew? So when Roger's mom came back and there were meetings and there was this and there was that, and the students would say, I can't believe about Roger's mom again, or I can't believe that. And I, at one point, overhearing them, turned to them and said, well, is this something that everyone knew? And they're like, yeah, Miss T. But no one wanted to tell the teachers because everyone knew that he'd get pulled out and they might get put into foster care. And I was like, wow, our students and student voice is such an untapped resource in our community, right? Now, again, there are limitations and legal questions around tapping into student voice, especially in a situation like this. But I think that it begs the question for us as educators and as administrators, and especially looking at our topic here today, how can we access student voice to help paint a picture for us of what we may or may not know is happening in the school setting? Next slide, please. So when we think about across the country, like, what are the obstacles that keep us from accessing student voice? What are the obstacles that keep us from being out of connection with our students? And so when we think about well-being, when we think about Allison's work, the work that FRAC is doing, when we think about that connection between students and school stakeholders, right? That voice, that insight into what's happening in the school community is huge. And that insight can help inform decision makings. Now, for that insight to be present, students and teachers have to be in connection. And for students and teachers to be in connection, we know that happens in a climate and culture that is safe. We know that happens in a climate and culture where students can trust that their voices will be heard equitably. Next slide, please. Time. What is the thing that keeps us from happening? Time. Across the country when I do this work, it's always time. Teachers will say, I want to be in connection with my students. I want to hear student voice. But there just isn't time. I have so much content to cover. And I would like to say that that landscape is changing in education, but sadly, I don't think it is. And so if we're looking to have time magically appear for students and teachers to be in connection, for us to be able to tap the resource, the untapped resource often of student voice, right? That no one's going to wave a magic wand that's going to appear. So what we have to do is we have to come up with a list of priorities. We have to stick by those priorities, and we have to say that by bringing students and teachers into connection, conversations are had, useful conversations are had that provide insight, invaluable insight into the climate and culture of our school, right? Had I been in a stronger connection, had there been space for student voice in my classroom, perhaps Roger's situation, I would have been able to been involved in a remedy, in a solution much quicker. It wouldn't have been his sister stealing food from the cafeteria where we as teachers and administrators in the building were like, oh, so that's what's going on, right? There would have been space for conversation for Roger himself to maybe express his needs. That's what we're going for, especially when we think about creating a safe climate and culture for our schools. Next slide, please. This slide speaks for itself. And when we think again about communities and we think about everything from school safety plans to crisis intervention teams, again, it comes back to a couple things. It comes back to teachers, administrators often saying, wow, I didn't know. I didn't know this was present or a possibility on my campus. I didn't know. And teachers feeling that sense of remorse, regret, compassion fatigue, and students feeling this sense of regret, remorse, and fatigue. So often it goes without being said that a crisis intervention plan, a school safety plan has to take into account the immediate. But what can we do on the proactive side? And then what can we do on a side, and I don't want to say reactive, but instead thinking of crafting structures and systems and protocols where they become part of the climate and culture of our school, right? It's not something so, oh, this won't happen again. It's something that supports the school community, bringing teachers and students in connection, making room for student voice, making room for teacher voice. So again, something is sustainably there and in place. And if things do get a little left of center, right, there's space for that voice, those voices to be heard. Next slide, please. When we talk about these issues, I would be remiss to not bring up, of course, the suicide rates that are increasing in our country as well, especially at the middle school level, looking as well at the high school level. These suicide rates are increasing, and I know that I don't have to tell you all that. I know it's at top of mind for all the schools that I'm working with. And again, I'm going to bring us back to this piece of, is there space currently in the procedures and protocols, the systems that are in place in your school for voice to be heard, student voice to be heard, for students and teachers to be in connection? And if there isn't, right, what can we do to create a structure that will support a practice or practices? Next slide, please. So these are the questions that come up when I visit schools. Should we spend money for metal detectors, or should we spend money for PD? Should we spend money for increased security, or should we spend money for self-care for school stakeholders? Money for drug dogs or money for direct service for students? And the reason that I'm bringing up the money lens is when we think about something like teacher well-being, when we think about something like professional learning for teachers, that is costly. Right? Even if we say, well, we're gonna get a yoga class for our teachers after school, and we're gonna put XYZ system in place, and we're gonna get this professional development provider to come in, those pieces are expensive, and they're also not tangible. Whereas if you buy a metal detector, it's a tangible item. So you're like, okay, I spent $15K, and here it is, and there we go. School is safer. All right, there's an argument to be made for that, for sure. However, we also have to make the case that if we're asking our teachers to prioritize self-care, well-being for themselves, for their students, if we're asking our teachers to enter into conversation with students, difficult, challenging conversations, or to be comfortable being in connection with students, or to be comfortable shaving off some instructional minutes, prioritizing some of those non-instructional social-emotional learning elements, we have to give them the tools to be able to do that effectively so they feel like it's making an impact. And so often what I'll do when these questions are posed to me, instead of making them an or, right, statement, because in a way it's almost an impossible choice. And you might be an administrator who's on the line shaking their head saying, yeah, I can't decide PD over a metal detector. Okay, but can you somehow figure out both? Can you somehow figure out modeling self-care or well-being for your school stakeholders, even if you can't afford professional learning, even if you can't afford resources, right? What you do as a school leader and how you model these practices, the same practices we're asking our teachers to model for our students or to engage in with our students, that is powerful stuff. Next slide, please. So what is a key to your school's successful approach to this work? So again, thinking about moving beyond, right? Do we need to have crisis intervention plans and school safety plans? Absolutely. But again, if we're looking at this on the proactive side, right? What we're looking for are things that are pieces that are habit forming. We're looking for pieces that are reformatting those neural pathways in students' minds. So instead of moving students to a place where school is punitive, consequential, reactive, giving students the tools and teachers the tools to disengage from that power piece, and instead just being present, being focused as best as possible, so they can trek through their school day, understanding their emotions, being able to regulate those emotions, and teachers creating space for that during instruction, or as I mentioned, outside of that instructional time, whether it's in a passing period, whether it's when students first enter the classroom during the school day, right, during first period. How do we create space for student voice to be heard? How do we model students and teachers being in connection? How do we practice self-care? So we understand that as administrators, we're modeling that for teachers and we're modeling that for students. These are all pieces that we want to be habit forming, but for them to be habit forming, for those neuro pathways to be reformatted, they have to be a practice. And so you'll notice I keep saying this, practice, practice, right? Because this isn't a one and done piece. This is something that must be practiced over time. Just thinking of my own response to my mother-in-law this past weekend, right? I want to be triggered. I want to lose my cool, but I know that that does me no good in the long run, right? And so I have to practice when I'm triggered and I want to lose my cool, practice be operating from a place of calm, operating from a place of compassion. But again, this is a practice, the same way we expect our teachers and students to be modeling this strategy in school. Next slide, please. So step one, a climate and culture of well-being. What does that look like? What does that sound like? Next slide, please. To start, I'm going to ask us all to engage in a little practice. So I'd like you to scoot to the edge of your chairs and roll your shoulders back 3 times. Now roll your shoulders forward 3 times. And sit up as tall as you can. If closing your eyes is accessible, great. And if not, then pick a spot to focus on in the desk or table in front of you. I'd like you to find a breath or 2 or 3 and work on taking a moment right now for you. Knowing the needs of your school, knowing the needs of the demographic of the community that you're serving. What is the why behind this work for you? Has your school or your community been touched directly by violence? And you're looking for a strategy to safeguard against that happening as much as possible ever again? Or are you operating from a place or joined us today because you realize, oh shoot, we're not prepared. We've only focused on the school safety plan. We haven't focused on XYZ. Where are you? And just notice where you are. You have your own personal story, your own personal history behind this work that brings you with us today. And there's no right and there's no wrong to this. But notice what the driver is for you. So as we enter on this journey together, you can make some of those tough decisions that I talked about a few slides back. So breathing it in and breathing it out for another moment before we move forward. Taking a moment for you, for your own self-care. Taking a moment just to check in. Thank you so much. Next slide, please. So we have worked with the University of Chicago for the past 2 years, collecting data on student and teacher social-emotional learning competency. The data that I'm going to share with you today is reflective of a teacher survey that we did. We started small, and then this year we've surveyed 1,000 teachers with my school partners across the country. Now, if you'll notice here, it illustrates this arrow with talking about our research design, illustrates the connections between all of these pieces. So you've heard me talk about well-being. You've heard me talk about social emotional learning competency, teacher competency, implementation, right? And you'll notice here at the very bottom of the arrow that it starts with teacher competency, that we have to work on training our teachers and making sure that they have the chops, whether it's the social emotional learning chops or looking at creating a safe climate and culture chops, whatever that might be, whatever the lens is that you're looking at this work through today. Before we think about school-wide implementation, now often, especially when we're looking at school safety, we jump to the second point on the arrow, right? I'm going to buy the metal detector. I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. I've got a plan. Next. But what we really have to think about is making sure that we're building capacity within our buildings and within our districts to create a sustainable container to hold the work. Now you'll notice that third dot on the arrow, only after we've done that can we start looking at student competency in SEL. Can we start saying, hey, we've trained our teachers. Now we have systems and structures in place across the school. Now we can start focusing on student social emotional learning. Look at student competency around this. Now, the reason I say this is because so often when we're looking to adopt an approach to social emotional learning and adopt an approach to shifting our school climate and culture, to creating an emotionally and physically safe space for students to learn. So often we dive right to the student competency side. We buy a program, quote unquote, and say, all right, we've done it. Check the box, next. And I would say, well, no, we haven't, right? That's the same as buying the metal detector and saying, all right, we're done. Well, no, we're not. Because we haven't done any of the work to put students and teachers into connection, to create space for student voice, to teach teachers how to create space for student voice. They might say, I don't want to teach this. I want to teach my third period math class. I don't want to enter into connection with my students, and I don't really know how, and I'm not really comfortable, and no one taught me how to do this, because when I got certified to teach, social emotional learning wasn't a thing, and all those pieces are true. And so if all those pieces are true, then we have to honor our teachers' needs before we expect them to teach content or implement practices that they may or may not be familiar or comfortable with. Then you'll notice that last piece here is children's well-being, our students' well-being, and of course, inherently, our teachers as well. So much of the work that we've done, and you'll see this in a couple of slides, around the data, teacher satisfaction, questions of teacher retention, is that teachers are experiencing compassion fatigue. Their well-being isn't a priority to themselves, or they don't feel so in their school buildings. And so when we look at questions like very heavy and loaded questions that are in the news now about teachers and guns in school, decisions that are made, like the one that was recently made in Wyoming, right? And we don't have time, and this isn't the context to dive into that decision, but when we think about those pieces, we need to make sure, regardless of one's politics, that teachers' well-being is something that's on everyone's radar. That's something that's one of everyone's concern. Next slide, please. So notice here, when we're looking at social emotional learning, we're talking about, again, a school climate and culture. Now, pulled a couple examples here from the teachers that we have surveyed, right? And you'll notice that this isn't as cut and dry as one might think, right? Now, if you look, there's tons of good climate and culture work out there. We look at Danielson, which here in Chicago we use quite a bit, right? We see this social emotional learning piece, the school climate and culture piece, appearing everywhere from common language across the school to how it's appearing in behavioral guidelines, into social emotional learning lessons. So again, this just goes back to the point that this work, we have to codify. We can't be something that we expect teachers to just know because they can read it in a standard or because they can read it in a look for or a district framework. We have to give teachers high quality professional development. We have to check in their own well-being to make sure that we're building capacity internally if we expect to make an impact or a shift in the climate and culture of the school. Next slide, please. And again, just giving us a little data here, looking at the pre-test and the post-test of the teachers that we're serving, as well as, and then next slide, please. And then as well as really doing a bit of a deep dive into what teachers need, where they think impact is. So if you'll notice here, if we count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 down, you'll notice, and forgive me, I don't have a pointer, else I'd use the pointer on our feature here. 5 down, routines and structures to keep track of my students' emotions at the beginning of the school day. 4, to keep track of my students' emotions throughout the school day, right? We have there a significant change in teachers' ability to do that, and their perceived ability to do that. Now, I point that out because, again, if we think of my story with Roger, my student who was dealing with a high stress situation on top of living in a neighborhood that was plagued by gang violence, right? When we think about the need for student voice, so often it's creating mechanisms for teachers and students, again, to be in connection, and not only to be in connection, but to have data to track that work. So I can not just look at Roger now, but I can look at Roger 2 weeks from now, 3 weeks from now, or a month ago, and be able to see where there was progress, or to be able to see where there was regression. So often, right, we say, like, I didn't see it coming. I didn't know what was going on with that student. Or they were quiet. They were never a disruption in class, right? We don't have the data to back up our own perception of a student's school experience. And so what we need, besides engaging, connecting with students and helping them find their voice and creating mechanisms and space for that, is we need to collect data and track our students in a way, of course, that honors their needs and honors teachers' time. Next slide, please. So when we think about that piece, how could we do that with fidelity? Right? Do we want teachers to be walking around with checklists? This kid's smiling, they're not smiling, smiling, they're not smiling, right? No. And I say that glibly, but at the same time, we have to think about questions like usefulness versus compliance. We have to think about things like, does our school have a culture of common understanding around what students' social emotional needs are, what teachers' social emotional needs are? Is everyone prioritizing student voice, student and teacher connection in a way, right, that we're willing to make time for it? Or is it something that's given lip service to in a professional development, la, 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 or is a reaction to something bad that happened in our school, la, 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 and then 6 months later, it's business as usual? And so again, we really always, when we think about practices that we're going to adopt to the school setting, we have to make sure that we think about usefulness versus compliance and overall thinking about fidelity. Whatever you leave here, leave this webinar, leave our time together today in 15 minutes, right? A short 15 minutes from now, are you going to have the tools in place, right, to start small but implement with fidelity? Next slide, please. So again, as I mentioned, data collection. How to use data to make informed decision making, to inform your decisions about your students, right? So again, moving beyond having a solid plan and moving into that being proactive, a proactive approach, so we can see things coming down the pike. We can see potential red flags when they're there, right? Versus just reacting when something terrible happens. Next slide, please. So you'll notice here, this is data from one of my school partners in New Hampshire, right? And you'll notice here we were tracking disciplinary referrals, saying, okay, if we can look at the impact of this work on students' acts of aggression, of violence, disciplinary referrals, right? Would that help? Would that help be a predictive, proactive measure, right? And yes and no. Because again, you're looking at this data after the fact. So we're able to say like, oh, 2015, 2016, 2017, yes, referrals have gone down. Yes, this is having an impact. That's awesome. However, we're doing this analysis months after these referrals were collected, right? So next slide, please. So what my research partner and I did is we came up with a tool that evaluates student need in real time. And so when students are walking in the door, they're self-reporting. And then the teacher, so like if they were self-reporting at 8 o'clock, at 8:03, the teacher gets this little pie chart that shows where their students are. Are they ready to learn? Are they not ready? Are they almost ready? And then we're able to track that data proactively. So if we have a student that's not ready for the entire week, then we can say, all right, I need to check in with Roger. He's not ready for this entire week. Or, hey, I need to check in with Roger. It's day 2. Typically, if I look back at his history, he's been reporting all green. Now he's reporting red. What's going on here, right? Now, you may not have the time or resources to create your own tool like this, but again, thinking about the resources that you do have in your building. What resources do you have, and how can you employ, right, those fabulous school counselors, those fabulous school social workers to help you create something like this that can honor student needs as it's happening versus looking back historically at student data and saying, oh, shoot, we should have seen X, Y, and Z coming, but there was no space in our school's climate and culture. There was no room to engage in those conversations with students, or we don't prioritize student-teacher connection. So that student was kind of, as they say, lost in the shuffle, right? And so with a tool like this, or whatever tool you develop at your own school, utilizing what resources you have at hand, right? Again, always thinking through it through the lens of having a plan once something happens is great, but how can we proactively construct an approach, utilizing the resources, bringing student and teacher into connection, finding space for student voice, right? So we can, I don't want to say predict because that's not the right word, but how can we be able to proactively cut this off at the pass almost, right? See things coming, respond to red flags. And then when and if and hopefully not something terrible does happen, we have the systems and structures in place to those lines of communication are already established. Those venues of support are already there, versus creating systems and structures for people to be supported only after something negative has happened, once people are already stressed or already traumatized, right? And so again, thinking of what you have right now in place, the resources and supports that you have. Now, when I talk about, and I need to make sure I make note of this, when I talk about utilizing your social workers and your school counselors, let's not throw another thing on their plate. They can't pop into every classroom, peek in, see if kids are okay, peek into another classroom, right? What we can do, though, because they know the landscape of our school, they see so many of our students, we can employ them as a fabulous resource to help us create a tool that makes sense. Next slide, please. So step 3, facilitate student-teacher connection by consistently making room for student voice and expression. So you've heard me say this, I'm such a champion for this, and forgive me if I'm a broken record, right? But I think it's so important to think of how and when you do this, and making sure that we do this third step with intention. So for instance, I have so many teachers that have, through our work together, created, whether it's a peace place in their classrooms, or they've included tools, whether they're mindfulness tools or dysregulation. You know, teachers have these pieces in place, but so often, if the teacher is triggered themselves, they forget to use it. And so they'll say, oh yeah, I had a peace place, but I was so upset, or the student was so upset, or XYZ. Or I did this strategy a lot after the initial professional development training, and then I kind of forgot about it, or it kind of pittered out, right? And so you'll notice here my emphasis on consistently making room for student voice and expression. And I think as administrators, which I know many of you are on the call, this is something that you have to voice as the school leader. So when you're thinking about the climate and culture of teachers' classrooms, and you're evaluating your teachers on the climate and culture of their classroom, are you evaluating them on whether or not there is room in that climate for student and teacher connection? There's room made and space made for student voice. So when there's conflict in the class, Are the teachers looking at restoring the climate and culture of the classroom, or are they looking at just responding to the climate? Now, when I say, facilitate student and teacher connection, it really is about you as the school administrator modeling it, making it a priority, and letting your teachers know that, hey, I have invested resources in professional development or in XYZ books or XYZ tools. So you have the chops to be able to make this happen in your classroom. And because I've invested resources in it, I'm going to evaluate you on it. I'm going to expect to see it, right? And so it's that piece that taking it from the theory and really to that boots on the ground, rubber meets the road, that's when we see the change. Because it is scary for teachers to step into the vulnerable. And you're asking them to change a lesson that they've been teaching, a lesson that's been successful, to switch that lesson up, to create room for student voice and or teacher and student connection, hopefully both. You're asking them to teach new content and a new instructional strategy all at the same time. And they're saying to you, hey, listen, and they may not, but they may be saying, I thought we spent money on the metal detector. Can't I just teach the social studies lesson? Right? And you're going to say, yeah, we did spend money on the metal detector, but I need you to make space and time for this work and know that as your administrator, I've got your back. So your well-being is a priority of mine as well. And here's what I'm going to do on that end. Because I realize that your tank might be empty. You might be experiencing or have experienced compassion fatigue. So you might say, hey, listen, there's no room left for me to hold a student up when they're struggling because I can barely hold myself up right now. And so again, it's that balance of all of these steps together, right? Teacher well-being, student well-being, making that a priority. Really putting your money where your mouth is and saying, not only are you going to make the student and teacher piece a priority, you're going to expect teachers to make space for it. And finally, right, step 2, really thinking about the data. Because if we're going to say to our teachers, to our board members, hey, listen, you got to make this a priority. And they're going to say, what? We've got testing, we've got this. I thought we just spent the money on the metal detector. Now you're coming at it with this too. And you're going to say, yes, because our data that we're collecting on student social emotional learning needs is telling us this, the anecdotal evidence that we're collecting from student and teacher conversation, from hearing student voice, whether it's creating a certain student count element of the student council, right? Student unity groups, etc. Administrator student breakfast, whatever it might be. And it looks different at every campus I work with. But however you get students and teachers and administrators together, and however you compile all that anecdotal evidence, and however you look at the real-time data that you're hopefully collecting with your students on their social emotional learning needs, right? Let these decisions be data-driven. Let the practices that you use be evidence-based. And then give everyone the support they need to implement with fidelity. Next slide, please. So when we implement these 3 steps, and again, looking at the integrity, looking at the intentionality behind the work, we see this sense of connectedness, right? School, this opportunity for voice, for creative and self-expression. SEL practices, looking at this creating common language for student growth, for teacher growth, and then hopefully this connected place where students and teachers are empowered to find their voice in the world. They're empowered to express not just what's happening with them, but what they're observing about their environment, what they're observing about the climate and culture of the school, what they see that we might not see from our view as administrators and teachers. That important information that they can add to the conversation. Next slide, please. So quickly, I want to touch on mindfulness, and I want to make sure that I highlight this quote by Viktor Frankl. This practice of being present to find the space between stimulus and response. If these practices, in fact, do become a practice in our school, in our classrooms, in our buildings, then the hope is that instead of being reactive, instead of being triggered, that folks, teachers and students, are given the lifelong learning tools to find the space between stimulus and response. Instead of going for the violent action, I'm able to take a breath and be present. I'm able to find that space. And so often our teachers and our students not only weren't taught that space, they weren't giving that space, they're not given it now. And so this is something we have to model from the top down to make sure that it's a priority, to make sure that we're saying at our school, this is part of the climate and culture of our building. We make space. We make space because we all have faced triggers, and we're making space to find that space between stimulus and response. Next slide, please. So there's three strategies here we're going to share. Sadly, we don't have time today. So what I'll do, as Joan mentioned, is I'll make sure that I email them to you. There's three strategies here. One is a Mucca doodle, one is a still point, and then one is called write and rip and share. And what I'll do is I'll email these to you with my contact information to make sure that if you implement these with your teachers, and I hope that you do, I hope you share them at a faculty meeting, right? But then you can report back and say, hey, Carla, we tried this, we tried that. It kind of worked, it kind of didn't, right? Or I loved it, or I hated it. And how can you help guide us through this process? Because again, it's the power of modeling, of you saying, I'm going to take time out of this faculty meeting to experientially walk us all through this strategy. The power of modeling, not just photocopying it and putting it in their mailboxes, but saying, I'm investing time the same way I expect you to invest time. Next slide, please. Here's a sample of what the Mucca drawing looks like. And again, simple, easy, but it's the power of you prioritizing it and your staff seeing you prioritize it, which gives them permission to prioritize it as well. Next slide. Again, still point, a strategy we'll share, you'll get via email. Next slide. So 3 steps before we close. Creating a culture of well-being. We've talked about that. Making sure that you model that piece. Step number 2, the data-driven decision-making, collecting real-time student-level social-emotional learning data. I shared the example that Dr. Kim and I came up with that we utilize with our school partners. But again, looking at your own resources, what are your own tools that you can develop for your school building that would suit your demographic? And last, making connections and listening to our students. Listening to our students, making space to listen, making space for us to be learners as well. And then also creating a safe space for those conversations to take place. Next slide, please. So thinking about setting a goal as we close, what are the 3 things, the 3 steps that can impact the students you are serving? What are 3 things, 3 steps you can take? You might say, I can't take these 6 steps now, but I can do these 3 things. I can do this one thing. What can you do? Next slide, please. As you think about this, making sure that you keep safety as a priority, you keep predictable routines as a priority, and you make sure that there is a balance between consistent expectations and flexibility of a caring environment. So you've got to create those boundaries. You've got to make sure, though, that those boundaries are buttressed by predictable routines and a safe environment. We can't take these practices and implement them in an environment that doesn't feel safe for students. A, it doesn't work, and 2, it's just not fair. Next slide, please. So when you think about a goal, what goal can you implement? Now, what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to email me that goal. So I'd like you now, I'm going to put if you put the next slide up, please. I'm going to give you my email address, and I'd like you to email me your goal. What is the thing that you can implement in the next 2 weeks? I'm going to implement all 3 steps, Carla. This is what I'm going to do. I'm going to do X, Y, Z. This is what I'm going to do. And then when you email me your goal, not only will I email you those 3 strategies, but maybe I'll email you an additional strategy to share, or I can be a sounding board. I'm also going to be presenting at NASSP over the summer. Hooray, hooray. Here is my session title, Everyday Social Emotional Learning, right? I'd love to see you on Wednesday, July 11th. So not only can we start the conversation now, I can support you as you need, but then face-to-face, if you bring any strategies, you bring any thoughts to share, right? We can dialogue either before or after the session as well. It's very important with me, and if I have any friends who've worked with me before, you know that I like webinars or conference sessions to just be the start of the conversation, not a one and done, but for you to know that I'm an email away to support this work on your journey because I believe in this work. I've seen the positive impact of this work, and I want you to feel supported in your role. And I know sometimes that's hard because like, who do I turn to with questions? What way I tried this and it didn't know that I am a phone call or an email away. I want to thank NASSP for their time today and for prioritizing this very important work. And I'd like to encourage you all to reach out with any thoughts or questions as you enter this journey. Thank you so much. It's truly been an honor to be with you today.
Thank you so much, Carla. I can't wait to get your email and look at those practices and see how we can model and implement them and attend your session at the conference and hopefully have you start the conference with yoga in the morning. And I hope that each participant online will take a moment for their own well-being, because for you to support your teachers and students, it's important that you stop and breathe and take care of yourselves. So thank you all for participating in the webinar tomorrow. And just to remind you so that you can, there are questions that we did capture. We promise we will email to them, and Carla has so graciously offered to respond to make sure that you each get the response to your question. And we also hope that we will see you at our National Principals Conference in Chicago, July 11th through 13th. And you can learn more about the conference at the email address www.principalsconference.org, and you'll have the opportunity to speak with Carla first thing on the first morning. So thank you all for being with us, and we hope you all go out and take care of yourselves. Thanks so much.
Thank you.